Ancient clay tablets scattered across museums worldwide tell a story that archaeology can't fully explain. The Sumerians, one of humanity's first great civilizations, left behind thousands of texts describing beings called the Anunnaki, a name that translates roughly to those who came from heaven to earth. These weren't vague sky spirits or abstract divine concepts. The tablets describe them with the kind of practical detail you'd expect from historical records. Job titles, family trees, specific geographical locations, tools, weapons, vehicles that moved through the sky with fire and thunder. We can prove the Sumerians existed. We can read their language. We can visit the ruins of their cities. But the Anunnaki, that's where documented history ends and mystery begins. If you're here to fall asleep to ancient mysteries, hit subscribe and let me know where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking the comments and seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, Los Angeles at midnight, all watching at once. There's something perfect about falling asleep to stories that span the entire world and reach back thousands of years. Tonight, we're going to explore 10 specific stories about the Anunnaki that historians can't definitively prove true. Not because they're definitely false, but because we're stuck in this fascinating gray zone between archaeological evidence and mythological possibility. Some of these stories align with strange gaps in the historical record. Others echo similar myths from completely unconnected ancient cultures. A few present details that make you wonder how people with crude tools and no telescopes could have known certain things about our solar system or describe technologies that sound disturbingly modern. We'll talk about genetic engineering claims from 4,000-year-old texts. A mysterious 12th planet that supposedly approaches Earth every 3,600 years. Ancient gold mining operations in Africa that predate known civilizations. The Sumerian pantheon interpreted not as gods but as alien administrators. Wars fought with weapons that sound like advanced energy devices. Underground cities that suggest hidden bases. Knowledge encoded in cuneiform tablets. Genetic anomalies some researchers find suspicious. Why these beings allegedly left Earth. And persistent prophecies that they'll return. Here's what this video isn't. A definitive claim that aliens created humanity or ruled ancient Mesopotamia. Here's what it is. An honest look at 10 stories from our ancient past that don't have simple explanations. Stories that sit in that uncomfortable space between what we can prove and what we can't dismiss. The truth is, we don't know everything about our origins. The historical record has massive gaps. Ancient civilizations demonstrated knowledge we can't fully account for. And the Sumerians left behind texts describing things that sound impossible. Each story we'll explore tonight will be presented with both the alternative interpretation and the scientific explanation. You'll hear what the ancient texts actually say, what evidence exists, what mainstream archaeology concludes, and what remains stubbornly unexplained. Because the goal isn't to convince you of anything. The goal is to walk through these mysteries together, examining them from every angle, and letting you decide where possibility ends and fantasy begins. So let's begin. Let's talk about the Anunnaki and the 10 stories that refuse to fade away, no matter how many millennia pass. The story that started everything. The one that makes some people wonder if ancient Mesopotamia witnessed something we're not supposed to talk about in polite academic circles. The creation of humans by beings from somewhere else, not through divine miracle, but through something that sounds disturbingly like genetic engineering. The primary source is a collection of Sumerian texts, particularly the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis epic, carved into clay tablets around 4,000 years ago, though the stories they contain are probably much older. What they describe is strange. According to these texts, the Anunnaki didn't create humans from nothing. They modified something that already existed. They took primitive hominids, creatures the texts describe as essentially animals, and mixed their essence with the divine. Changed them. Upgraded them. The language used is what makes modern researchers pause. The texts describe blood of the gods mixed with the clay of the earth. Not metaphorical clay, according to some interpretations, but the biological material of existing creatures. One passage describes the goddess Ninhursag, working with the god Enki, taking the clay from the Abzu, the primordial waters, and mixing it with divine blood to create workers. The Akkadian term used is awilum, which means human, but the process described sounds clinical, deliberate, experimental. Compare what these ancient texts describe with what we know about human evolution. For millions of years, our ancestors changed slowly. Gradual modifications over enormous time scales. Bigger bodies, slightly larger brains, incremental improvements in tool use. Standard evolutionary progression. Nothing unusual. Then suddenly, in evolutionary terms, something remarkable happened. Around 200,000 years ago, cognitive abilities exploded. Brain size increased dramatically in a relatively short period. Abstract thinking emerged. Language developed. Symbolic reasoning appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Within a cosmically brief window, creatures that had been making the same simple stone tools for hundreds of thousands of years were suddenly creating art, building complex shelters, developing intricate social structures, asking questions about the stars, burying their dead with ritual. Anthropologists call this the cognitive revolution, and they don't fully understand it. There are theories: climate pressure forcing adaptations, dietary changes providing better nutrition for developing brains, social competition driving intelligence. But none of them completely explain why the change was so rapid, so dramatic, so transformative. This is what some researchers call the missing link problem. Not a missing species, but a missing explanation for how cognitive abilities advanced so quickly when physical evolution typically moves at a glacial pace. Anunnaki theorists point to this gap and say, what if it wasn't natural? What if something intervened? According to this interpretation, the Anunnaki were advanced beings, possibly from another world, possibly from another dimension, possibly from a more developed human civilization lost to history. Where they came from matters less than what they allegedly did. They found primitive hominids, creatures with potential but lacking the cognitive abilities needed for civilization, and they modified them. Not through teaching, not through cultural transmission, but through direct biological intervention. The Sumerian texts describe this process in terms that make geneticists uncomfortable. They talk about creating workers, beings designed for specific purposes. They describe mixing essences, combining the nature of the divine with the nature of the earthly. They use language of blood and clay, of divine breath and earthly matter. Strip away the mythological framing, and some researchers see descriptions of genetic engineering. Taking existing genetic material from primitive hominids, combining it with genetic material from the Anunnaki themselves, creating a hybrid species with enhanced cognitive abilities. The Atrahasis epic is explicit about the purpose. The text explains that the lesser Anunnaki were exhausted from their labor. They were digging canals, excavating the earth, extracting resources. The work was so intense that they rebelled against the elite Anunnaki leadership. The solution wasn't to improve working conditions. It was to create a new worker class. Humans. Beings capable of labor, of following instructions, of maintaining the infrastructure the Anunnaki needed, but also beings with just enough intelligence to be useful, not enough to be threatening. And isn't that exactly what you'd expect from advanced beings conducting biological experiments? Not creating equals but creating useful tools. The perfect servants. Some researchers point to specific genetic anomalies in human DNA as potential evidence. The fused chromosome that distinguishes humans from other great apes. Chromosome 2 in humans appears to be a fusion of two separate chromosomes found in chimpanzees and other primates. It's neat, complete, and unexplained in terms of why this particular fusion became fixed in the human population. Then there are the relatively recent changes in genes associated with brain development. The FOXP2 gene, linked to language ability, shows modifications that are evolutionarily recent. The ASPM and microcephalin genes, both involved in brain size regulation, also show patterns of recent selection. The HAR1 gene, which is active in developing brains and differs significantly from the chimpanzee version, changed rapidly in a short evolutionary window. There's also the unusually low genetic diversity in human populations compared to other species. Chimpanzees, despite having far smaller total populations, show much greater genetic variation than humans. This suggests a population bottleneck in human history, a period when human numbers dropped dramatically, limiting genetic diversity. Some interpret this as evidence of a small founding population, perhaps the result of selective breeding or genetic experimentation rather than natural evolutionary processes. The scientific consensus, however, says no. These anomalies have natural explanations. Chromosomal fusion happens. It's rare but viable. If it occurs in a reproductive cell and doesn't impair survival, it can spread through a population over time. Genetic bottlenecks occur naturally through climate events, volcanic eruptions, or migration into new territories with small founding groups. Rapid evolutionary changes are possible under intense selective pressures. You don't need ancient aliens with test tubes to explain human origins. Natural processes are sufficient. But the story persists because it touches something deep in human psychology. The feeling that human consciousness is different, special, somehow disconnected from the animal kingdom we emerged from. The sense that our rapid rise was too dramatic, too complete, too transformative to be entirely natural. We went from making the same crude hand axes for a million years to building civilizations, writing poetry, and splitting atoms in what amounts to an evolutionary eye blink. Maybe that's just human exceptionalism talking. Our egos refusing to accept that we're just another species, remarkable only because we're the ones telling the story. Or maybe, in the quiet hours before dawn, maybe it's something else. A racial memory of when we were changed. When something reached down and rewrote what we were, turning animals into something that could look up at the stars and wonder if someone was looking back. We can't prove the Anunnaki created us through genetic manipulation. The evidence isn't there. No fossilized laboratories. No ancient genetic sequencing equipment. No clear signatures in our DNA that scream artificial intervention. Modern genetics shows a messy, natural-looking evolutionary history, complete with the redundancies and vestigial sequences that accumulate through millions of years of random mutation and selection. But we also can't fully explain why we became what we are. The cognitive revolution remains mysterious. The timing of key genetic changes raises questions. The sudden flowering of symbolic thought, language, and culture happened faster than standard evolutionary models comfortably predict. And in that gap between what we know and what we wonder, the ancient stories continue to whisper. What if the myths remembered what the scientists forgot? What if creation wasn't metaphor but description? What if we're not evolution's accident, but someone's design? The question remains unanswered, which means it remains possible. And possibility, however remote, is enough to keep the story alive. Enough to make us look at those ancient clay tablets and wonder if the Sumerians were recording not fantasy but memory. Memory of the day when beings from the sky mixed their essence with the earth and created something new. Created us. The texts are there. The genetic mysteries are real. The gap in understanding persists. Whether that gap will be filled by natural science or by something stranger, we don't yet know. For now, the story of our creation remains exactly what it's always been. Half proven, half mystery, and entirely impossible to forget. Here's where the Anunnaki story gets astronomical in every sense. According to the most popular interpretations of Sumerian texts, these mysterious beings didn't come from some vague location in the heavens. They came from a specific place. A planet called Nibiru, sometimes referred to as the 12th planet in ancient records, following an elliptical orbit so extreme that it only comes close to Earth once every 3,600 years. Pause and appreciate how specific that claim is. We're not talking about ancient people vaguely pointing at the stars saying the gods came from up there. We're talking about detailed astronomical knowledge recorded in cuneiform tablets thousands of years old. Knowledge that, according to some researchers, describes planetary movements and celestial mechanics that ancient civilizations supposedly couldn't have understood. The story begins in the 1970s with Zecharia Sitchin, a scholar who could read ancient Sumerian and Akkadian. Sitchin spent decades translating cuneiform tablets, focusing particularly on texts dealing with cosmology and the origins of humanity. What he claimed to find was extraordinary. According to his interpretations, the Sumerians possessed detailed knowledge of our entire solar system, including planets that weren't officially discovered until modern times. Uranus, discovered in 1781. Neptune, confirmed in 1846. Pluto, identified in 1930. The ancient Sumerians, according to Sitchin, knew about all of them thousands of years earlier. More than that, they supposedly knew about an additional planet. Nibiru. A massive world with an orbit unlike anything in our conventional solar system. While Earth and the other planets orbit in relatively circular paths, all staying roughly in the same plane, Nibiru allegedly follows a wildly elongated ellipse that takes it far beyond the outer planets before swinging back toward the inner solar system every 3,600 years. Sitchin based these interpretations primarily on a Sumerian cylinder seal known as VA-243, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin. This seal, dating to around 2500 BCE, shows various figures and symbols. In the upper left portion, there's a depiction of what Sitchin identified as a star surrounded by 11 dots or globes. To Sitchin this was obvious. The star represented our sun. The 11 globes were planets: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, our moon counted as a separate body, and Nibiru itself, making 12 bodies total in the Sumerian cosmology. True, this would be staggering. It would mean that 4,500 years ago, without telescopes, without spacecraft, without any of the technology that allowed modern astronomers to discover distant planets, the Sumerians somehow knew the exact configuration of our solar system. Not approximately. Not in some symbolic way. But with precision that shouldn't have been possible. Sitchin went further. He translated various Sumerian creation myths, particularly the Enuma Elish, as describing not spiritual or metaphorical events, but actual astronomical catastrophes. According to his interpretation, Nibiru entered our solar system billions of years ago. Its gravitational influence disrupted the orbits of existing planets. It collided with a planet called Tiamat, located between Mars and Jupiter, splitting it in two. One half became Earth. The other became the asteroid belt. The Moon was a satellite of Tiamat, captured by Earth after the collision. This interpretation would explain several astronomical puzzles. Why Earth's axis is tilted at 23.5 degrees. Why our Moon is unusually large compared to our planet. Why the asteroid belt exists in what seems like an incomplete planet's orbit. Why Earth's ocean basins seem like scars from massive ancient impacts. Every mystery, every anomaly in our solar system structure, explained by this one catastrophic event billions of years ago. And Nibiru, having caused all this chaos, settled into its extreme orbit, returning to the inner solar system every 3,600 years. Each time it approached, the Anunnaki would travel to Earth, checking on their genetic experiments, their mining operations, their human workers. Then they would depart again, not to return for another 3,600 years. The story is breathtaking in scope and specificity. It's also, according to most mainstream astronomers and Assyriologists, completely wrong. Let's start with the cylinder seal. Professional cuneiform scholars who have examined VA 243 say the interpretation is mistaken. The star symbol surrounded by dots doesn't represent the sun and planets. It's a common Sumerian representation of a deity, specifically the star of Shamash or Ishtar. The dots aren't planets at all, but decorative elements or stars in the symbolic sense. Ancient Near Eastern art is full of similar imagery that has nothing to do with astronomy. More fundamentally, there's no evidence the Sumerians knew about Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto. Their astronomical records, which are extensive and detailed, consistently describe 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They were brilliant observers of these planets, tracking their movements with impressive precision. But there's no credible evidence they knew about anything beyond what you can see by looking up on a clear night. The astronomical search for undiscovered planets is real, though. Modern astronomers have spent decades looking for what they call Planet 9 or Planet X, not because ancient texts suggested it, but because of subtle gravitational anomalies in the outer solar system. Some trans-Neptunian objects have orbits that seem to be influenced by something massive that we haven't detected yet. But the planet astronomers are looking for, if it exists, would be far beyond Neptune, with an orbital period of 10,000 to 20,000 years, not 3,600. And it certainly wouldn't come anywhere near Earth. Here's the problem with Nibiru from a physics standpoint. If a planet-sized object with significant mass swung through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, its gravitational effects would be catastrophic and ongoing. Planetary orbits would be constantly perturbed. We'd see evidence of regular disruptions throughout geological history. Ancient astronomers from multiple civilizations would have recorded its appearances. There would be consistent references to this recurring catastrophe in texts from Babylon, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica. Instead, we have silence. No civilization except the Sumerians, in heavily disputed translations, mentions anything like this. Ancient Babylonian astronomical texts, which are extraordinarily detailed, show no awareness of a 12th planet or a 3,600-year cycle. Chinese astronomical records, spanning thousands of years, contain no references to such an object. The absence is telling. Yet the story persists, and not without reason. The Sumerians were remarkable astronomers. They developed the mathematical framework we still use to measure time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. All Sumerian innovations based on their base 60 number system. They could predict eclipses, track planetary movements, create star catalogs of impressive accuracy. So how did they develop such sophisticated astronomical knowledge without telescopes? The answer is time and obsession. For thousands of years, Mesopotamian civilizations maintained continuous astronomical observations. Priests would spend entire lifetimes recording the movements of celestial bodies. Knowledge accumulated across generations, creating data sets that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation. Given enough time and dedication, you can figure out an enormous amount about the cosmos with nothing but careful watching and meticulous record-keeping. But this raises another question. Why were they so obsessed with astronomy in the first place? Most ancient cultures practiced some astronomy, usually tied to agriculture and calendars. The Mesopotamians took it further, developing what amounts to an astronomical tradition that lasted millennia. What motivated this extraordinary dedication to watching the skies? Maybe it was purely practical. Agriculture depends on accurate calendars. Religious festivals needed proper timing. Astrological divination, which the Mesopotamians practiced extensively, required precise planetary positions. All reasonable explanations. Or maybe there's something we're missing. Some tradition now lost that gave astronomical observation special importance in their culture. Some memory, perhaps, of when the sky held more than just stars and planets. When it held visitors. The Nibiru story, for all its flaws, taps into something real. The sense that ancient peoples knew things we've forgotten. That somewhere in those clay tablets and cylinder seals, there's information we haven't properly decoded yet. Not necessarily about planetary catastrophes or alien homeworlds, but about how ancient minds understood the cosmos and their place in it. Modern archaeology keeps finding that ancient civilizations were more sophisticated than we assumed. More connected. More knowledgeable. More capable. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek astronomical calculator of stunning complexity. The precision of Mayan astronomy. The architectural achievements of cultures we once dismissed as primitive. So when someone claims the Sumerians possessed advanced astronomical knowledge, part of us wants to believe it. Because we keep learning they were more advanced than we thought. Just not quite in the ways the most dramatic theories suggest. The 12th planet remains unconfirmed. Unseen. Unprovable. No modern telescope has found it. No gravitational anomaly clearly points to its existence. The physical evidence doesn't support a massive world swinging through the inner solar system on a predictable schedule. But the mystery of why ancient people watched the skies with such dedication, what they really understood about what they saw, and whether there's more to their astronomical knowledge than we've recognized, that mystery is very real indeed. The tablets speak of Nibiru. The seals might show something we've misinterpreted. The astronomical knowledge is genuine, even if its source remains debated. Somewhere in that combination of real observation, mythological storytelling, and possible lost knowledge, the truth waits. Whether that truth involves a hidden planet or simply a more sophisticated ancient astronomy than we've given credit for, we don't yet know. For now, Nibiru remains where it's always been. Somewhere between the stars and the stories, real enough to be recorded, distant enough to stay mysterious. Deep in the mountains of southern Africa, scattered across what is now South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Eswatini, there are thousands of ancient mine shafts. Not medieval mines. Not even classical era mines. Some of these excavations date back tens of thousands of years, possibly longer. They are so old that when European colonizers first discovered them in the 19th century, they assumed they were natural formations. Because surely ancient humans couldn't have created such extensive mining networks, right? But they weren't natural. They were deliberate, systematic, incredibly sophisticated for their time. And they were focused almost exclusively on extracting one thing, gold. According to ancient astronaut theorists, this isn't coincidence. They claim these mines are evidence of the Anunnaki's primary mission on Earth. That these beings didn't come here to guide humanity or share wisdom or any noble purpose. They came to extract gold. Massive quantities of it. And they needed workers to do the mining. The theory goes like this. The Anunnaki homeworld, that mysterious planet Nibiru, was experiencing an atmospheric crisis. Their atmosphere was deteriorating, letting in harmful radiation, destroying their civilization. Their scientists discovered a solution. If they could suspend fine particles of gold in their upper atmosphere, they could create a protective shield, reflecting radiation back into space and saving their world. The problem? They needed enormous amounts of gold. More gold than existed on Nibiru. So they searched the solar system and found Earth. A planet rich in gold deposits near the surface. Perfect for large-scale extraction. They established mining operations and got to work. The archaeological evidence that supporters of this theory point to is genuinely fascinating. The most extensive ancient mining operations are found in the Mpumalanga province of South Africa and surrounding regions. These aren't small primitive dig sites. They're massive networks of interconnected shafts and tunnels, some extending hundreds of feet underground. Some of these mines show evidence of advanced engineering techniques that shouldn't exist in the time periods they're attributed to. In the 1970s, researchers examining these sites dated some mining operations to at least 100,000 years ago. Some estimates push certain sites back even further, to 200,000 years or more. This creates an immediate problem for conventional archaeology. The standard narrative says humans 100,000 years ago were small bands of hunter-gatherers focused on basic survival. They weren't organizing large-scale industrial operations. They weren't systematically extracting specific mineral resources for purposes beyond immediate tool-making. They certainly weren't mining gold, which has no practical use for Stone Age survival. But these mines exist. They're real. They required significant labor, planning, and coordination to create. Someone organized this. Someone directed workers to specific locations, taught them extraction techniques, processed the ore, transported it somewhere. The question is, who and why? Ancient astronaut theorists point to Sumerian texts for answers. Several cuneiform tablets describe the Anunnaki engaging in hard labor when they first arrived on Earth. The texts mention digging, excavating, extracting resources from deep in the earth. One famous text, the Atrahasis, describes the Anunnaki gods complaining about the difficulty and hardship of this work. The labor was so intense that the lesser Anunnaki, the workers, eventually rebelled against the elite Anunnaki leadership. This rebellion supposedly led directly to the creation of humans, a worker species designed specifically to take over the mining operations. From this perspective, the entire human creation story becomes a corporate solution to a labor dispute. The Anunnaki created us to be miners. Our original purpose was extracting gold for our alien overlords. And the evidence, they claim, is scattered across southern Africa in the form of ancient mines that predate any known human civilization. But here's where we need to slow down and examine the alternative explanations. Because while the mines are real and genuinely ancient, the interpretation of their purpose and origin is far from settled. First, the dating of these sites is controversial. Some researchers have challenged the extreme age estimates, suggesting that many of these mines might be far more recent than initially claimed. Dating ancient mines is notoriously difficult. You're not dating the excavation itself, but organic materials found near or within it. Those materials could have been deposited much later, giving false readings. Natural geological processes can make excavations appear older than they are. Second, we have extensive evidence that ancient humans valued gold for reasons having nothing to do with atmospheric engineering. Gold doesn't tarnish, doesn't corrode, catches light beautifully, doesn't rust even when buried for millennia. These properties made it valuable for decoration, ritual objects, and status symbols across virtually every human culture. The desire to obtain gold doesn't require alien instruction. It requires basic human psychology and aesthetic appreciation. Third, the scale of these operations, while impressive, isn't necessarily beyond human capability. Archaeological evidence from around the world shows that ancient peoples were capable of organizing large-scale labor projects when motivated. The Egyptian pyramids required millions of person-hours. The Great Wall of China involved hundreds of thousands of workers over centuries. Angkor Wat demanded massive coordination and resource management. Humans have always been capable of organizing complex projects when cultural or economic incentives aligned properly. What's more, gold had practical uses beyond decoration. In some ancient cultures, gold was used in metallurgy experiments, combined with other metals to create alloys with useful properties. It was used in dentistry in some regions. It served as a store of value and medium of exchange in emerging trade networks. You didn't need aliens to explain why ancient peoples would invest significant effort in gold extraction. But the Anunnaki theory raises an interesting question. If aliens were directing these mining operations, where's the infrastructure? Where are the processing facilities? Where's the evidence of advanced technology that would have been necessary to extract, refine, and transport gold on the scale required to save an entire planet's atmosphere? You can't mine millions of tons of gold using Stone Age technology. You need industrial-scale equipment. Smelting facilities, transportation networks, administrative centers to coordinate everything. Ancient astronaut theorists have an answer for this, of course. They argue that the Anunnaki took everything with them when they left, or they deliberately destroyed the evidence, or thousands of years of geological processes have buried or destroyed the remains, which is convenient but also unfalsifiable. If you can explain away the absence of evidence by claiming it was removed or destroyed, you can believe almost anything. The Sumerian texts themselves are open to multiple interpretations. The word translated as mining could also mean cultivating or working the earth. The descriptions of labor might be metaphorical, describing agricultural development rather than industrial extraction. Ancient languages are notoriously difficult to translate precisely, especially when describing technical processes or using figurative language. And there's another problem. The timeline doesn't quite work. The most ancient mines in southern Africa date to perhaps 100,000 years ago at the very most. But Sumerian civilization, where the Anunnaki stories originate, didn't emerge until around 4500 BCE. That's a gap of nearly 95,000 years. If the Sumerians were recording actual historical events involving Anunnaki mining operations, why is there such a massive temporal disconnect? Professional archaeologists studying these South African sites have a different explanation. They argue that ancient human populations in Africa did engage in mining, including gold mining, but on a much smaller scale and for entirely earthly reasons. Red ochre, a mineral used for body decoration and ritual purposes, was mined in South Africa at least 100,000 years ago. This is well documented and uncontroversial. Some researchers suggest that what appear to be ancient gold mines might actually be later operations that intersected with older, unrelated excavations, creating the impression of a single ancient mining complex. Others point out that many of these sites were worked continuously for thousands of years by different cultures, making it difficult to determine when the original excavations began. Still, there's something haunting about those ancient mines. Walking through tunnels carved thousands of years ago by hands we can barely imagine, you can't help but wonder what drove people to such efforts. What motivated them to dig so deep, to extract so much, to organize on such a scale? Maybe it was simply the human drive to acquire valuable resources. Maybe it was religious devotion, extracting sacred metals for temples and gods. Maybe it was early economic networks, supplying gold to distant trade partners who valued it highly. Or maybe, just maybe, there's something to the story we haven't fully understood yet. Something that connects those ancient excavations to stories told thousands of miles away, thousands of years later, about gods who came from the sky and put humans to work in the earth. We can't prove the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold. The evidence for that specific claim doesn't exist. But we also can't fully explain why those mines exist in the pattern they do, at the age they are, focused so specifically on gold extraction at a time when humans supposedly had no use for it beyond basic ornamentation. The mystery remains open, waiting in the darkness of those ancient shafts, still keeping its secrets after all these thousands of years. The gold is gone, taken somewhere, used for something. The miners are long dead, their motivations lost to time. All that remains are the tunnels, the unanswered questions, and the stories whispered in clay tablets half a world away, speaking of gods who needed gold and humans who were created to provide it. When ancient Sumerians looked up at the night sky, they saw something we've mostly forgotten how to see. Not just stars but stories. Not just planets but people. Gods who moved through the heavens with purpose and power, who descended to earth in flames and light, who walked among humans and shaped civilization itself. The question that haunts researchers today is simple but profound. Were these gods merely symbolic, poetic attempts to explain natural phenomena and human experience? Or were they something else entirely? Something we've dismissed too quickly in our rush to explain away the past? Let's start with what we actually know. The Sumerian pantheon wasn't a loose collection of vague spirits. It was a detailed hierarchical organization that reads more like a corporate structure than a mythology. At the top sat Anu, the sky god, the supreme authority. His name literally means sky or heaven, and texts describe him as dwelling in the highest heaven, rarely descending to earth. In the ancient astronaut interpretation, Anu represents the leader who remained on the homeworld or orbiting command ship, directing operations from above. He makes decisions, issues commands, settles disputes between his subordinates, but he doesn't get his hands dirty with day-to-day management of Earth operations. Below Anu were his sons, and this is where things get interesting. Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Wind, or Lord of the Command, was placed in charge of Earth operations. Texts describe him as arriving in a divine storm, with thunder and lightning announcing his presence. He established his headquarters at Nippur, which Sumerians called the bond between heaven and earth. The temple there, the Eker, wasn't just a religious site. According to the tablets, it was Enlil's actual residence, the place where he issued commands and made decisions that affected all of humanity. Then there was Enki, Anu's other son, called Lord of the Earth. But his domain wasn't the surface. Texts consistently place Enki in the Abzu, the watery depths beneath the earth. He was credited with creating humans, with establishing the arts of civilization, with bringing knowledge to humanity. In ancient astronaut theories, Enki is often cast as the scientist, the genetic engineer, the one who advocated for humanity against his brother Enlil's harsher governance. The relationship between Enlil and Enki dominates Sumerian texts. They weren't just rival deities. They had opposing philosophies about how to treat humanity. Enlil saw humans as workers, servants created for a purpose. Enki saw them as worthy of knowledge and advancement. This conflict plays out in story after story, including the flood narrative, where Enki warns the humans Ayusudra to build an ark while Enlil plans humanity's destruction. But here's what makes the Sumerian pantheon genuinely strange compared to other ancient mythologies. The level of detail is extraordinary. We have job descriptions, family trees spanning multiple generations, specific geographical locations for each deity's headquarters, lists of their tools and weapons, descriptions of their vehicles, the divine boats of heaven that move through the sky with fire and noise. One text describes Enlil's arrival this way: when Enlil's word is carried high, abundance and prosperity follow. When his word reaches the earth, green vegetation sprouts. Agricultural blessing. But it also says his arrival shakes mountains, and his voice thunders like a storm. That's a peculiar mix of agricultural benefit and something that sounds distinctly like rocket propulsion. The Anunnaki themselves were described as numbering exactly 50 in the earliest texts. 50 beings who came down from heaven to earth. Later texts expand this to include their offspring and servants, creating a complex hierarchy. There were the Igigi, sometimes called the Watchers, who remained in orbit or in the upper atmosphere. There were the lesser Anunnaki who worked on Earth. And there were humans at the bottom, created to ease the labor burden of the lower-ranking Anunnaki. What's fascinating is how this hierarchical structure mirrors descriptions of sky beings and cultures worldwide. The Egyptian Neteru, the Hindu Devas, the Greek Olympians. They all share similar organizational patterns. Supreme sky gods at the top. Specialized deities handling different domains. Conflicts between factions. Interbreeding with humans creating hybrid lineages. And technology that seems impossible for the supposed time period. Flying vehicles. Weapons that sound like advanced energy devices. Healing chambers. Devices that grant immortality or extended life. In Hindu texts, the Vimanas are flying palaces that move through the sky with fire and smoke. In Mayan codices, the gods descended in skyboats that roared like jaguars. In Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories, the Wangina came from the sky in vehicles that shook the earth. In Dogon tradition in Africa, the Namo descended from Sirius in an ark that spun and made terrible noise as it landed. These aren't vague mythological beings. They're described with the kind of practical detail you'd expect from eyewitness accounts. The scholarly explanation is cultural diffusion and universal human psychology. Humans everywhere look at the sky and wonder. Humans everywhere experience natural phenomena, storms, meteors, eclipses, and try to explain them through story. Humans everywhere create hierarchies because that's how we organize ourselves. So naturally we imagine divine hierarchies too. The similarities across cultures in this view reflect shared human nature, not shared encounters with actual beings. And this explanation makes sense. It's grounded in what we understand about how cultures develop and how mythologies function. Mythology serves crucial purposes. It explains natural phenomena before scientific understanding. It provides moral frameworks and social cohesion. It gives meaning to human suffering and purpose to human existence. The Sumerians needed to explain floods, droughts, earthquakes, disease. Creating a pantheon of powerful but temperamental gods who could be appeased through ritual made the random cruelty of nature feel manageable. When crops failed, it wasn't random. It was Enlil's anger. When floods destroyed cities, it wasn't geological chance. It was divine judgment. When disease struck, it wasn't microorganisms. It was supernatural punishment or demonic influence. But the ancient astronaut interpretation keeps returning to those details. Why describe Enlil's arrival with such specific sensory information? Thunder, earthquake, blinding light, mountains shaking. That reads less like poetic metaphor and more like someone describing something they actually witnessed. Something terrifying and unprecedented. Something that left a mark on collective memory so deep it was preserved in text for thousands of years. Consider the Sumerian king list, which divides history into two periods, before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, kings reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reign lengths become more realistic, more human. The ancient astronaut interpretation suggests the pre-flood kings were actually the Anunnaki themselves, or human Anunnaki hybrids with extended lifespans due to advanced genetics or technology. The conventional interpretation says the long reign periods are mythological, symbolic of a golden age, not meant to be taken literally. And yet, the Sumerian king list doesn't read like mythology. It reads like a chronicle, mixing the extraordinary pre-flood rulers with ordinary post-flood ones without changing tone or style. It treats both periods as equally historical. The pantheon includes female deities with equally specific roles. Ninhursag, also called Ninmah, is credited with assisting in the creation of humans. She's described as the Lady of Life, a title that sounds medical, biological. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, is the goddess of love and war, a combination that seems contradictory until you consider her as a powerful individual with complex personality traits rather than an abstract concept. These deities have personal relationships. They marry, divorce, have affairs. They get jealous, angry, vengeful. They play favorites among human cities and kings. They form alliances and betray them. They sound, in short, like people. Very powerful people with advanced technology, but people nonetheless. The texts describe their possessions with surprising specificity. Enlil has a sublime radiance that can destroy cities. Inanna has a boat of heaven that she uses to travel between cities. Enki has tools called mi, often translated as divine powers, but described more like technologies or knowledge sets that can be stolen, transferred, or lost. Inanna famously tricks Enki into giving her the mi while he's drunk, then flees in her skyboat before he sobers up and realizes what he's done. This story appears in multiple tablets and is treated as historical fact within the Sumerian worldview. Inanna takes the mi, the fundamental technologies of civilization, from Enki's city of Eridu to her own city of Uruk, transforming Uruk into a major power. If you read this as mythology, it's a charming story about the transfer of cultural knowledge between cities. If you read it as ancient astronaut theory does, it's a corporate espionage incident involving stolen technology. The pantheon also includes beings with very specific technical roles. Ninurta is described as a warrior god, but his myths detail him using various weapons and tools to defeat monsters and shape the landscape. He dams rivers, creates mountain ranges, redirects waterways. These sound less like divine miracles and more like massive engineering projects described in mythological language. Nergal is lord of the underworld, but his domain is reached by descending through 7 gates, each requiring the removal of a piece of clothing or regalia. Ancient astronaut theorists see this as a decontamination procedure, a security protocol for entering an underground facility. Conventional scholars see it as symbolic death and rebirth imagery, a mythological representation of the transition from life to death. The academic view has strong evidence on its side. We can trace how the Sumerian pantheon evolved over time. Earlier versions of deities had different characteristics. Local city gods were gradually incorporated into a larger unified pantheon as Sumerian cities formed political alliances. The mythology changed to reflect political realities. When Babylon rose to power, their patron god Marduk was retroactively inserted into the creation story as the supreme deity, displacing earlier gods. This evolution suggests cultural development, not historical record. Myths adapted to serve the political and social needs of the moment. The pantheon wasn't describing real individuals but personifying natural forces, political powers, and human psychology. Thunder became a god. The sun became a god. War became a god. Love became a goddess. Each major aspect of human experience got personified and given a name. Yet the specific details continue to nag. The Anunnaki don't just appear. They land. They don't just speak. They use communication devices. They don't just live forever. They have access to something, some substance or technology, that extends life. The food of life and water of life appear repeatedly in texts, physical substances that grant immortality to those who consume them. In one famous story, a human named Adapa is brought before Anu in heaven. Enki warns Adapa not to eat or drink anything offered to him, saying Anu will try to poison him. But Anu actually offers Adapa the food and water of life, which would have made him immortal. Adapa refuses, following Enki's instruction, and loses his chance at immortality. The story treats this as a tragic misunderstanding, not a metaphor. What makes the Anunnaki narrative so compelling is this constant tension between myth and history, between symbolic interpretation and literal reading, between what makes sense to our modern scientific worldview and what the texts themselves seem to be saying. The Sumerians weren't writing fantasy. They were recording what they believed to be their actual history. The origins of their cities, their institutions, their knowledge. Whether that history was distorted through cultural lenses, whether it was mythological from the start, or whether it preserved actual encounters with something extraordinary, that's the question we still can't answer with certainty. What we can say is that the Sumerian pantheon remains one of the most detailed and influential mythological systems ever created. Its influence spread to Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures. Its echoes appear in biblical texts, in Greek mythology, in religious traditions across the ancient Near East. Something about these stories resonated deeply enough to survive millennia of cultural change. Were the Anunnaki gods, aliens, or metaphors? The texts themselves won't give us a simple answer. But they'll keep us wondering, keep us questioning whether the ancients were writing poetry or history. And maybe that uncertainty, that mystery, is exactly what makes these stories still matter thousands of years after they were first carved into clay. The tablets describe a pantheon that acts like people, thinks like people, makes mistakes like people. A pantheon with technology, with family drama, with political intrigue. A pantheon that supposedly lived among humans, then withdrew, leaving behind only their stories and their hybrid descendants. Whether that describes divine beings, extraterrestrial visitors, or the universal human need to explain the inexplicable through story, each person must decide for themselves. The evidence, as always, remains tantalizingly incomplete, open to interpretation, impossible to definitively prove or disprove. The ancient texts don't just tell stories of gods creating humans and mining gold. They describe something far more disturbing. Or, not metaphorical spiritual battles, but actual physical conflicts with weapons, tactics, and devastating casualties. Wars between the gods themselves, and sometimes wars where humans were caught in the crossfire. The Sumerian tablets are shockingly detailed about this. They describe conflicts between different Anunnaki factions, disputes over territory and resources, battles for control of specific cities and regions. These weren't simple disagreements. They were full-scale wars with armies, strategies, and weapons that the texts describe in terms that still puzzle researchers today. Take the conflict between Enlil and Enki, two of the most powerful Anunnaki leaders. According to the tablets, their rivalry wasn't just political. It was violent. They commanded different factions, controlled different territories, and repeatedly clashed over how humans should be treated and what role they should play in Anunnaki society. Some texts suggest these conflicts lasted for thousands of years, with periods of open warfare followed by uneasy truces. But here's what makes these accounts genuinely unsettling. The descriptions of the weapons used in these conflicts don't sound like anything from ancient human warfare. The tablets describe what they call weapons of brilliance, devices that could destroy entire cities, weapons that made the earth shake and filled the sky with fire. One text describes a weapon that raised a storm that demolished the land, that ripped away the vegetation, that like a flood wave reached the heights of heaven. That's not a metaphor for a particularly effective sword. That's describing something else entirely. Something with destructive power that ancient humans had no frame of reference for except natural disasters. Floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. The texts use the language of natural catastrophe to describe weapons of war. The most detailed account comes from what researchers call the Era Epic and various lament texts describing the destruction of several Sumerian cities during what appears to be a conflict between Anunnaki factions. The text says, "A storm was released that turned day into night, that made stones and large hailstones rain from the sky, that caused people to abandon their cities in terror." The storm is described as something created deliberately, something unleashed as a weapon. Modern readers have noticed something striking about these descriptions. They sound remarkably similar to accounts of nuclear weapons. The brilliant light. The devastating blast wave. The cities left abandoned and uninhabitable. Could these texts be describing something like atomic warfare? It's a disturbing possibility, one that seems absurd until you start looking at the archaeological evidence. Because here's the thing. Ancient cities did get destroyed catastrophically, suddenly, in ways that archaeologists still struggle to explain. Take Mohenjo-Daro, one of the great cities of the Indus Valley civilization, abandoned around 1500 BCE. This thriving urban center with sophisticated architecture and advanced city planning was suddenly abandoned. When archaeologists excavated the site, they found evidence of extreme heat. Pottery fused together. Stone walls partially melted. Scattered skeletons that showed no signs of burial or scavenging, as if people had died instantly where they stood. Some researchers have pointed out that parts of the site show vitrification, the process where intense heat turns sand and stone into glass. This requires temperatures far beyond what Bronze Age technology could produce. Nuclear weapons can create vitrification. So can lightning strikes and volcanic activity. But there's no volcanic activity in that region, and no evidence of a massive lightning storm. The official archaeological explanation is that the city was abandoned due to climate change and the drying up of the Sarasvati River. That makes sense for why people would leave. It doesn't explain the vitrification or the unburied bodies. It doesn't explain why the site was never resettled even though the location remained strategically valuable. Similar mysteries appear across the ancient world. Jericho, according to biblical accounts, had its walls brought down not by siege engines or battering rams, but by something the text describes as the sound of trumpets and the power of God. Archaeological excavations show the walls did collapse suddenly, falling outward rather than inward, which is unusual for a city under siege. The conventional explanation is an earthquake, but the timing described in the texts, the precision of the destruction, it raises questions. Then there's the plain of Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities described in Genesis as being destroyed by fire and brimstone from heaven. For centuries, this was dismissed as pure mythology until archaeologists started finding evidence of a massive destruction event in the Dead Sea region around 1650 BCE. Multiple settlements were suddenly abandoned, showing evidence of extreme heat and blast damage. The distribution pattern of the destruction suggests it came from above, not from invasion or internal collapse. Natural explanations exist. Meteor strikes, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes. Any of these could account for the physical evidence. But they don't account for the pattern. Because when you map out these destruction events across the ancient world, something interesting emerges. They cluster geographically and chronologically in ways that seem to correlate with the conflicts described in Sumerian and biblical texts. The texts themselves make explicit connections between divine warfare and earthly destruction. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes weapons that could shatter mountains, battles in the sky between gods, and conflicts that left the land barren for generations. The Mahabharata, the great Indian epic, contains even more detailed descriptions of what it calls celestial weapons. The Brahmastra is described as a weapon that could destroy entire armies, that created a vertical explosion with a pillar of smoke, that contaminated the land making it uninhabitable. One passage reads, "A single projectile charged with all the power of the universe. An incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as 10,000 suns, rose with all its splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt, a gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race." That description appears in a text thousands of years old. It describes a mushroom cloud. It describes radiation. It describes nuclear warfare in terms that wouldn't be out of place in a modern military report. The conventional interpretation is that this is poetic exaggeration, mythological hyperbole describing conventional weapons or natural disasters in dramatic terms. But the specificity is unsettling. These descriptions appear across multiple cultures, separated by thousands of miles, but sharing remarkably similar details. Bright light, mushroom-shaped clouds, devastating blast waves, lingering contamination. Either multiple ancient civilizations independently invented the same complex metaphors for divine power, or they were all describing something they actually witnessed. The challenge is distinguishing between natural disaster and technological catastrophe when you're looking at events that happened thousands of years ago. Ancient peoples didn't have our scientific framework. They would describe a meteor strike as divine judgment. They would interpret a volcanic eruption as the anger of the gods. But does that mean every description of heavenly fire and devastating blasts was a natural event? The Sumerian texts suggest otherwise. They describe deliberate conflicts, strategic decisions, weapons deployed with specific intent against specific targets. They name the commanders, describe the tactics, outline the political motivations behind the violence. These aren't vague myths about angry gods. They're detailed military histories. And they consistently describe a pattern where human cities became collateral damage in conflicts between Anunnaki factions. Wars that weren't primarily about humans at all, but where human populations suffered the consequences. Cities destroyed because they supported the wrong faction. Populations scattered because they occupied strategically important territory. Entire civilizations collapsing because the gods were fighting among themselves. One particularly detailed account describes a conflict between Inanna and her brother Utu over control of certain cities. The text says Inanna bathed the land in fire, that she turned the day into darkness, that her weapons made the mountains shake and the rivers boil. The cities that opposed her were left silent as death. Their populations fled or destroyed. Whether these accounts describe actual extraterrestrial conflicts with advanced weapons, or are elaborate mythological explanations for natural disasters and human warfare combined with Bronze Age imagination, they reveal something important. Ancient peoples experienced catastrophic destruction on a scale that terrified them. Events so devastating they could only be explained as divine warfare. And those experiences shaped their understanding of power, of conflict, of humanity's place in a universe where forces beyond their control could destroy everything they had built in an instant. The archaeological evidence keeps piling up. Destroyed cities, unexplained vitrification, sudden civilization collapses. And hovering over it all, these ancient texts describing wars in heaven that brought devastation to Earth. Some researchers point to additional evidence. Traces of radioactive isotopes in ancient layers at certain archaeological sites. Though these findings are heavily disputed and often attributed to natural uranium deposits or modern contamination. Glass-like stones called tektites found scattered across ancient battlefields, formed by extreme heat of unknown origin. Mass graves showing evidence of death by extreme heat or blast trauma rather than conventional weapons. But for every piece of suggestive evidence, there's a conventional explanation. The vitrification could be from lightning. The mass deaths could be from plague or conventional warfare followed by mass cremation. The abandoned cities could be victims of climate change, economic collapse, or invasion by human armies whose weapons and methods we don't fully understand. The truth is, we don't have definitive proof of ancient nuclear warfare or energy weapons. What we have are texts describing weapons of extraordinary power, archaeological sites showing evidence of catastrophic destruction, and gaps in our understanding of what really happened to certain ancient cities and civilizations. Whether those gaps will be filled by natural explanations, by evidence of forgotten human technologies, or by something stranger, we don't yet know. For now, the mystery remains. The weapons described in ancient texts sound impossible. The destruction at ancient sites looks suspicious. The correlation between the two invites speculation. Whether that speculation leads to truth or merely reflects our modern tendency to project our own technological capabilities onto the past, each person must decide for themselves. But on quiet nights, when you think about cities that died in fire, about weapons that turned day into night, about wars fought by gods while humans watched and burned, the ancient texts don't feel quite so mythological anymore. They feel like memories. Distant, distorted, but memories nonetheless. Of when the sky opened and something terrible descended. Of when the gods went to war and the world paid the price. Picture the world not from above but from beneath. Not temples rising toward the sky, but stairways vanishing into the dark. Not ziggurats and pyramids but tunnels, chambers and whole cities carved into the bones of the earth. According to some Anunnaki traditions and alternative theories, this is where the real story unfolded. Not just in palaces and public temples, but in hidden underground bases, secret facilities where the gods worked, experimented, and possibly retreated when the surface became unstable or inconvenient. The idea sounds like pure science fiction. And yet, when you start looking at the archaeological record, something odd appears. Over and over again, across cultures that supposedly never met, humans kept digging into the ground. Sometimes for shelter. Sometimes for storage. Sometimes for reasons we still don't fully understand. The claims begin with a simple question. If the Anunnaki were advanced beings used to the harsh conditions of space and alien worlds, where would they feel most at home on a still-forming, unpredictable Earth? Some researchers say not out in the open. They imagine subterranean command centers hidden beneath sacred mountains, beneath temple complexes, beneath what would later become legendary lost cities. Places where the Anunnaki could shelter from climate swings, cosmic radiation, even from their own human creations. We don't have confirmed evidence of such bases. What we do have are real underground structures that are just mysterious enough to keep the speculation alive. Take modern-day Turkey. Beneath the town of Derinkuyu lies one of the largest known underground cities on Earth. A honeycomb of tunnels and rooms descending perhaps 60 to 85 meters below the surface. Ventilation shafts, stables, storage rooms, kitchens, even what look like communal spaces big enough for hundreds of people. Engineered with such precision that fresh air can circulate through levels carved out of solid rock. Mainstream archaeology dates Derinkuyu mainly to the first millennium BCE and later, probably used as a refuge during times of invasion and religious conflict. But the exact origins are hazy. The deeper you go, the more ambiguous the story becomes. Some passages look older than the rest, as if new generations expanded on pre-existing caverns whose builders left no written record. For those who see the Anunnaki in every missing chapter, Derinkuyu becomes more than a fortress. It becomes the faint echo of a much older tradition. Powerful beings going underground long before history began to be written. And Derinkuyu isn't alone. Throughout Cappadocia, dozens of underground complexes riddle the soft volcanic rock. Many are interconnected. Some can shelter thousands of people. Combined, they form networks that stretch for kilometers. Then your attention shifts east to ancient Mesopotamia. Sumerian texts speak of the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater deep, home of the god Enki. In the myths, the Abzu is both a cosmic water reservoir and a sort of underworld domain, approached through temples and sacred precincts. We can't equate this directly with tunnels and bases, but the imagery is striking. Gods associated with deep places. Hidden realms under the earth. Secret knowledge stored below. Archaeologically, Mesopotamian temples do show layered construction. Foundations built over older foundations. Sanctuaries over older sanctuaries. Pit shafts. Ritual wells. Underground chambers that almost never see daylight. We know they were used for religious and administrative purposes. What we don't know is whether all their functions were purely ceremonial. In a culture that imagined its gods descending from the heavens, is it coincidence that so many myths also lead downward? Beyond Mesopotamia, the pattern continues. In Egypt, beneath the plateau of Giza, explorers have documented natural caves and man-made tunnels. Some are clearly quarry cuts or later burials. Others are harder to categorize. Subterranean chambers beneath the so-called Osiris shaft. Passages leading away from major monuments as if there were once broader networks, now collapsed or flooded. The official story is cautious. Geology, erosion, human activity over thousands of years make reconstruction difficult. But for those thinking in Anunnaki terms, Giza becomes not just a field of pyramids, but the surface expression of something deeper. Massive stone markers built over access points, like signposts over buried infrastructure. Farther afield, in Peru, legends speak of tunnel systems running beneath Cusco and the old Inca heartland. Spanish chroniclers recorded stories of passages filled with gold and mummies, sealed long before their arrival. Some entrances have been found near Sacsayhuaman and other sites, but many remain unverified or collapsed. Whether these were simple service tunnels, escape routes, or parts of something larger remains unresolved. And then there are cases like the Hypogeum of Halseflini in Malta, an underground complex carved around 4000 to 2500 BCE. Multiple levels. Curved, womb-like chambers with remarkable acoustic properties. A place of ritual, burial, maybe trance states. No Anunnaki texts. No explicit links to Mesopotamia. Just another example of humans choosing to carve their most sacred spaces not upward, but inward into the rock. For those who see a hidden pattern, all of this starts to look less like coincidence and more like a scattered blueprint. Anunnaki theorists propose that advanced beings might prefer underground facilities for very practical reasons. Temperature stability. Deep beneath the surface, temperatures barely change. Perfect for long-term habitation and storage. Shielding. Rock is a natural barrier against radiation, meteor impacts, and even large-scale surface disasters. Control. Access can be tightly managed. One entrance, one corridor, one chamber after another. A design well-suited for laboratories, command centers, or anything you don't want wandering humans to stumble across. On this view, some lost cities weren't lost because they sank into the sea or were swallowed by jungle. They were lost because they were never meant to be visible in the first place. They were built below, concealed from the world, and abandoned when their builders left or relocated. This is where tunnel networks enter the story. There are verified ancient corridors linking temples and settlements. The passages under Teotihuacan in Mexico, tunnels connecting plazas and pyramids. The Qanat systems of Iran, underground water channels extending for tens of kilometers. Roman catacombs and early Christian refuges carved out beneath cities. Most of these have clear earthly purposes. Water, burial, shelter. Yet rumors persist of deeper, older networks that don't fit neatly into any known period. Stories of passages connecting distant sites. Giza to the Nile Delta. Cusco to remote fortresses. Cappadocia to far-off valleys. Hard evidence for intercontinental tunnels is non-existent. But geologically, the Earth is riddled with caves, lava tubes, and fault-related voids. It's not impossible that ancient peoples exploited natural systems we haven't fully mapped yet. This is the crack where the Anunnaki narrative slides in. If natural tunnels exist, and if some human-made systems are still undiscovered, then some argue there is room for something older, deeper, not human at all. Perhaps early civilizations were given access to certain segments while the gods retained deeper levels. Perhaps when the Anunnaki left, entrances were sealed, myths were softened, and the memory survived only as fragmentary tales of underworlds, hollow hills, and cities beneath the sands. From a strictly scientific perspective, we have no confirmed Anunnaki bases. What we do have are real underground cities like Derinkuyu and Kemakli, ritual complexes like the Hypogeum. subterranean chambers beneath major temples and pyramids, legends of tunnels and hidden worlds in Sumer, Egypt, the Andes and beyond. The leap from those facts to extraterrestrial outposts is large. There are no inscriptions saying built by the Anunnaki, no alien metals, no unexplainable machinery, no smoking gun. And yet the story persists. It resonates with modern conspiracy thinking because it speaks to something deep in the human psyche. The sense that there is always more beneath the surface, that power hides itself, that the real decisions, the real technologies, the real histories do not take place in the open air, but behind closed doors or behind layers of rock. Subterranean Anunnaki bases blend several powerful ideas at once. Advanced beings, secret knowledge, concealed infrastructure, and a past far stranger than we were taught in school. Speculative archaeology picks up the tantalizing fragments, underground halls, unexplored shafts, myths of gods in the deep, and weaves them into a single shadowy narrative. Whether that narrative is true, half-true, or pure imagination, we don't yet know. All we can say with confidence is this: ancient people around the world invested enormous effort into going underground. They carved cities, shrines, storehouses, and labyrinths where sunlight never reached. And they told stories about powerful beings who came from the sky and then vanished into the earth. Between those two facts, there is a vast dark space. For some, it's simply the unknown. For others, it is exactly where the Anunnaki still are, waiting, hidden in bases we haven't yet rediscovered. The tunnels remain. The chambers stay silent. The ventilation shafts still draw air through solid rock. And somewhere in that darkness, between what we know and what we imagine, the mystery waits. Patient, unmoved by time, ready to reveal itself only when we're ready to look deep enough. By the time the first cities rose on the plains of Sumer, something strange had already happened to human knowledge. For hundreds of thousands of years, information had lived only in minds and voices. Then, almost suddenly in archaeological terms, it moved into clay. Tiny reed styluses pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet tablets. Words became symbols. Symbols became records. And in those records, some researchers believe the Anunnaki left more than myths. They left encoded instructions, fragments of a curriculum meant for a species they had just recently upgraded. Most of what we know about the Anunnaki comes from these cuneiform tablets. Administrative lists, royal inscriptions, hymns, epic poems, astronomical notes. But tucked among the grain tallies and tax records are stranger texts. Creation myths, star catalogs, descriptions of the gods' tools and measuring rods. This is where the idea of forbidden knowledge begins. Not because the tablets themselves are locked away in some hidden vault. Thousands of them sit in museums, university collections, even private hands. The mystery lies in how we read them, or according to some, how we've refused to. Ask mainstream Assyriologists which Sumerian texts are forbidden and most will tell you, none. There are difficult texts, damaged texts, obscure ritual instructions that nobody bothers to translate because they're repetitive or fragmentary, but not a secret bookshelf of banned tablets. Yet if you talk to alternative researchers, you hear a different story. They point to specific categories of writings that they claim are quietly sidelined. Creation epics like the Enuma Elish, where gods fashion humans to bear the yoke of labor. Lists of kings who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood. Astronomical tablets that some say describe planets we supposedly didn't know existed. Healing incantations that mix practical medicine with strange references to binding and loosening life force. On the surface, these are just myths, lists, and rituals. But viewed through an Anunnaki lens, they start to look like something else. Like pieces of advanced knowledge translated into the only language early city dwellers could understand. Story and symbol. Think about how you would explain a genetic laboratory to a Bronze Age farmer. You wouldn't talk about nucleotide bases or CRISPR. You'd talk about life writing in clay of the body, reshaped by divine hands. You'd say the gods molded humans, knit their sinews, commanded the blood to obey. That's exactly the kind of language we find in Sumerian and Akkadian creation texts. Gods mixing clay with the blood of a god, forming workers to relieve the gods of toil. To a traditional scholar, this is mythic metaphor. To an Anunnaki theorist, it sounds uncomfortably like a poetic description of genetic manipulation. The same pattern appears with astronomy. Sumerian astronomical texts are sophisticated. They track Venus cycles with precision, record eclipse patterns, catalog stars and constellations. Much of this can be understood as the result of careful naked-eye observation over centuries. But some lines make people stop. References to Mul Nibiru, a wandering star associated in later interpretations with a crossing planet. Mentions of 12 major celestial bodies, including the sun and moon, which some alternative writers interpret as proof the Sumerians knew of an extra planet beyond the ones visible to the unaided eye. Most Assyriologists disagree. They argue that Nibiru is a complex, shifting term. Sometimes Jupiter. Sometimes a point on the ecliptic. Sometimes a generic symbol of crossing or transition. They note that lists of 12 often group the sun, moon, and certain major stars, not a secret 12th planet. To them, claims of a hidden astronomical system are overreach, selective reading driven by modern expectations. But the debate itself is revealing. It shows how fragile the chain of translation really is. Every cuneiform tablet has to pass through multiple layers. Decipherment of the signs. Reconstruction of missing fragments. Choices about meanings of words with several possible senses. Then interpretation of context. At each step, decisions are made. Assumptions creep in. Ambiguity gets resolved one way or another. Alternative researchers seize on this. They argue that certain tablets, especially those touching on cosmology, origins, or divine technology, have been domesticated in translation, rendered safely mythic when more literal readings might hint at something else. Not because of a grand conspiracy, they say, but because scholars are trained to avoid anything that sounds too modern, too advanced. More dramatic claims go further. They suggest that some tablets have been mistranslated on purpose, that references to ships of the gods, heavenly chambers, or bright weapons have been softened into vague chariots and thunderbolts to prevent people from seeing the technological implications. Here the evidence becomes thin. We do have cases where early translations were wrong and later corrected, often in the direction of being less sensational, not more. A shining heavenly weapon becomes, after rereading the signs, a standard ritual implement. A skyboat turns out to be a poetic name for a constellation. These revisions don't prove deliberate suppression. They do prove how easy it is to read our own fantasies into damaged text. So what would forbidden knowledge actually mean if it existed? One possibility is technical knowledge. Advanced astronomy, engineering, medicine. Some healing texts describe surgical procedures, bandaging techniques, and herbal recipes mixed with incantations. To most scholars, this is early empirical observation wrapped in ritual. To a minority, it's a degraded memory of something more systematic, more scientific, handed down from teachers who understood the body in ways their students could only imitate. Another possibility is cosmological structure. Myths describing layered heavens and underworlds, gates between realms, measured distances between the divine abodes. In standard readings, these are symbolic geographies of the sacred. In Anunnaki interpretations, they could be garbled maps, star routes, orbital periods, maybe even references to other worlds the gods called home. Then there's social knowledge. Instructions supposedly given by the gods to kings. How to measure land, tax harvests, build ziggurats aligned to cardinal directions. This looks exactly like early statecraft. But if you view the Anunnaki as a ruling elite from elsewhere, it also looks like the deliberate construction of a controllable civilization. Teaching just enough mathematics, just enough architecture to build stable cities, but withholding whatever would make human workers independent. The uncomfortable part is that written evidence can support more than one reading. A phrase about the god descending in a storm could be a thunderstorm. Could also, if you really wanted to, be a craft coming down through clouds. The tablet doesn't tell you which one to pick. Your assumptions do. That's where the skeptical view becomes important. Critics of Anunnaki theories point out that the vast majority of cuneiform text is mundane. Loans, receipts, legal disputes, temple inventories. If an advanced extraterrestrial curriculum was encoded in the writing system, it's buried in an ocean of bureaucracy. They also note that every culture has myths of gods teaching humans agriculture, writing, law. You don't need aliens to explain why early city dwellers would imagine their new skills as divine gifts. They raise a deeper issue too, pattern hunting. When you already believe the Anunnaki brought forbidden knowledge, you're more likely to interpret any reference to measuring the heavens as advanced astronomy, any tablet of destinies as some kind of control device, any breath of life as technology instead of metaphor. The texts become mirrors reflecting the reader's expectations. But the skeptics don't agree on everything either. Assyriologists still argue over key words, over the identification of deities, over whether certain passages are literal or symbolic. Some see in the star lists a surprisingly sophisticated observational astronomy. Others call it largely divination, more concerned with omens than orbits. Legitimate scholarly debate exists, and it's not always as settled as popular summaries make it sound. That's where the tension lives between academic rigor and alternative interpretation. On one side, a method that insists on context, on the slow accumulation of evidence, on refusing to leap beyond what the tablets safely support. On the other, a willingness to connect distant dots, to treat myths as data, to ask whether just stories might preserve distorted memories of something that really happened. In the quiet dark, listening to these competing voices, it's possible to hold more than one thought at once. That the Sumerians were brilliant observers and storytellers who encoded their world in clay with astonishing skill. That our access to their minds is filtered through damaged tablets and debatable translations. That some of their myths sound eerily like people trying to describe technologies and beings beyond their comprehension. And that none of this, on its own, proves the Anunnaki were real visitors with a library of forbidden knowledge. The tablets sit in their cases in storage rooms, lines of wedges hardened by time. They tell us what they tell us and no more. The rest, what might have been meant, what might have been hidden, what might still be waiting in untranslated collections or unexcavated sites, that lives in the space between evidence and imagination. A space where, for now, the Anunnaki still whisper only in fragments. But those fragments are enough to keep the questions alive. Enough to make us wonder whether the ancients were recording simple myths, or whether they were preserving, in the only way they could, memories of a time when knowledge came from the sky. When beings who knew things humans shouldn't know walked among them, taught them, and then departed, leaving behind only stories carved in clay. Stories that have survived 4,000 years. Stories we still can't fully explain. Stories that might be mythology or might be history or might be something in between. The forbidden knowledge, if it ever existed, remains exactly that, forbidden, hidden, waiting to be rediscovered or forever lost to time. If the Anunnaki really walked the earth, and if they really altered early humans, then their fingerprint shouldn't just be in old clay tablets. It should be in us. In every cell. In every chromosome. In every quiet heartbeat as you lie in the dark, listening to stories about a past no one can fully prove or fully dismiss. According to the more imaginative versions of the Anunnaki theory, the story didn't end with a few upgraded workers in Sumer. It continued silently through bloodlines, through families, through what some researchers call the legacy of the gods. They claim that when the Anunnaki first mixed their DNA with that of early humans, they didn't just create a generic worker species. They created hierarchy. Most humans, according to this view, were basic hybrids. Good enough to mine, to farm, to build. But a few lines, a few carefully bred families, carried more of the divine genetic material. Those lines, the theory says, became the first priest kings. The rulers who stood between gods and humans because, supposedly, they were a little bit of both. This idea shows up all over ancient mythology. In Sumer, kings often claimed to be chosen by the gods or descended from them. In Egypt, pharaohs were children of Ra. In Mesopotamia, in Greece, in Mesoamerica, royal families insist they are a different kind of human. Not just richer. Not just more powerful. Different in their blood. Modern Anunnaki theorists take that language literally. They talk about Anunnaki bloodlines that supposedly run like hidden rivers through history. The kings of Sumer. The royal houses of Babylon and Assyria. Later dynastic families. Hittite rulers. Persian nobility. Even medieval European royal families are sometimes folded into one continuous story. That power follows a genetic thread, woven by beings who weren't entirely human. From a scientific standpoint, that's a massive claim. If true, it would mean that buried somewhere inside modern human genomes, especially in certain families, you should be able to find something odd. A pattern that doesn't quite fit. A genetic signature that looks like it came out of nowhere. So what does the actual genetic evidence say? When geneticists look at human DNA, they see a surprisingly tight family. Modern humans share around 99.9% of their DNA with each other. The differences that remain, eye color, skin tone, lactose tolerance, disease resistance, are tiny ripples on a huge ocean of shared ancestry. Two key tools get used a lot in these studies. One is mitochondrial DNA or mtDNA. It's passed almost entirely from mothers to children and it changes very slowly. When you trace mitochondrial DNA back through time, you don't find alien splices or recent mysteries. You find African ancestors, tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of years in the past. There's also the Y chromosome, carried by biological males and passed from father to son. That too traces back to ancient human populations, converging on what geneticists call Y-chromosomal Adam, again rooted in Africa, not in some unknown off-world lineage. So far, there's no verified segment of human DNA that can't be placed somewhere on the branching tree of life on Earth. We fit. Our genes connect us to earlier humans, to primates, to mammals, to life forms that existed long before anything like civilization. But that doesn't mean there aren't puzzles. Human evolution has some strange jumps. Our brains grew rapidly over a relatively short period, then stabilized. Our ability for language, symbolic thought, and complex culture appears suddenly, at least in archaeological terms. We share a fused chromosome, human chromosome 2, that looks like a merger of two ancestral ape chromosomes. It's neat, tidy, and complete, as if someone took two separate books and bound them into one. Mainstream science explains these things naturally. The fused chromosome likely occurred as a rare but viable mutation in a small ancestral population, then spread because it didn't harm survival or reproduction. Our cognitive leap is often tied to gradual neural and social changes, not a single moment of intervention. The suddenness is partly an illusion caused by an incomplete fossil and archaeological record. But for those drawn to Anunnaki stories, these anomalies look like signs. They say the fused chromosome is an evidence of genetic engineering. They say the rapid emergence of language and symbolic thinking is too sharp a curve to be just random mutation and selection. The claim about royal bloodlines pushes this further. Certain ancient families, they argue, weren't just culturally elevated. They were genetically distinct. Over time, as empires rose and fell, those bloodlines supposedly intermarried, fragmented, and moved, seeding Anunnaki DNA into elite families across the world. Modern conspiracy-style versions of the story take this to extremes, connecting contemporary political or financial elites to imaginary ancient hybrid trees. What would it take to actually support a claim like that? First, scientists would need to identify a specific set of genetic sequences in some human lineages that 1. Don't resemble any known human, Neanderthal, or Denisovan variation. 2. Don't resemble any known terrestrial species DNA. 3. Show a pattern consistent with a single, relatively recent introduction event, not ancient random mutation. You'd need independent labs from different countries and institutions sequencing and verifying the same unusual pattern, ruling out contamination, error, or misinterpretation. You'd need to show that these sequences actually do something. Some consistent, measurable trait rather than being random noise. Nothing like that has been confirmed. Instead, what we do see in the genetic record are known, understandable complexities. Traces of Neanderthal DNA in non-African populations. Traces of Denisovan DNA in people from parts of Asia and Oceania. Evidence of ancient interbreeding between different human groups. But all still firmly within the earthly human family. For most geneticists, that's enough. The tree of life is messy, tangled, and full of cross branches, but it doesn't require visitors from the stars. Alternative researchers aren't convinced. Some argue that any truly anomalous DNA would be classified immediately, hidden under national security, or quietly erased from the public databases. They point to the fact that much human genetic data is controlled by governments, universities, and large institutions, all of which have their own interests. If you believe those institutions are hostile to radical ideas, it's an easy step to assume suppression. Others go further, suggesting that the entire framing of human evolution is biased, that anything that doesn't fit a purely naturalistic story is dismissed before it's fully explored. In this view, the mystery isn't that we haven't found Anunnaki DNA. The mystery is whether we'd be allowed to recognize it if we did. Is there any modern population that looks genetically like it might carry something unique and unexplained from an extraterrestrial source? So far, no. Populations living in extreme environments, like Tibetans adapted to high altitudes or certain Arctic groups adapted to cold, carry remarkable genetic tweaks. But these adaptations can be traced to known human or Denisovan variants through processes of natural selection. They're extraordinary but not unearthly. When you go looking for a group with completely unprecedented genetic markers, you don't find a secret Anunnaki bloodline. You find humans. Slightly different, endlessly varied, but recognizably one family. And yet the idea doesn't quite die. Because in a way, the Anunnaki genetic story is less about hard data and more about how we feel when we look in the mirror. Are we the product of blind chance and slow, brutal selection? Or did someone help? Did someone sculpt the clay just a little? The tablets give us myths of gods shaping humans from dust and divine essence. Genetics gives us chromosomes, mutations, and population bottlenecks. Somewhere between those two images, between a god kneeling over wet clay and a gene quietly flipping in a cell, lies a space where stories grow. Maybe the Anunnaki never existed. Maybe our only alien inheritance is the strange, restless curiosity that makes us imagine them at all. But if any trace of them does remain, it isn't in a single royal family or some hidden elite. It would be in all of us. woven into the double helix that carries not just our past, but every possibility of our future. For now, the evidence says we're entirely human. The mystery is that for many that still doesn't feel like the whole story. We look at our own rapid evolution, our own strange cognitive abilities, our own unique place in the animal kingdom, and we wonder, maybe we're enough. Maybe we're the miracle. Maybe the real alien legacy isn't in our genes, but in our endless capacity to question where we came from and whether we're alone. The DNA stays silent on the question of the Anunnaki. It speaks only of Africa, of ice ages, of migrations and mutations, of a long, slow climb from the trees to the stars. But it doesn't explain why we climbed so fast. Why we alone, of all the species that ever lived, built cities and wrote poetry and wondered about our creators. That mystery remains. And in that mystery, the Anunnaki story finds just enough room to survive. By the time we reach the end of the Sumerian story cycle, something strange happens. The tablets that once spoke so confidently of gods walking among humans begin to hint at distance, separation, a thinning of the line between heaven and earth. The Anunnaki are still there in the texts, but they feel further away. In earlier myths, the gods feast in their temples, demand offerings daily, argue and bargain almost like powerful landowners. Later they retreat to more remote realms. Their meetings move from city courtyards to far-off divine assemblies. The language changes from when the gods walked among men to when the gods decreed from above. It's subtle, but it suggests a transition. A world where the overseers are no longer physically present, only remembered. Why did they leave? In the standard scholarly view, this is metaphor. The gods withdraw as political structures shift, as cities rise and fall, as priestly authority changes. But in the Anunnaki interpretation, this is taken much more literally. It's read as the record of a departure, an end to an experiment. The Sumerian flood story is often placed at the center of this transition. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods grow tired of human noise. People are multiplying too fast, disturbing divine rest. The solution is brutal. First plagues, then famine, then finally a catastrophic flood. A reset button. One god, Enki, subverts the plan, warning Atrahasis and teaching him how to build a survival vessel. Humanity doesn't disappear. But something does end after the flood. The gods change the rules. Human lifespan is cut. Fertility is limited. The relationship between the divine and human worlds is restructured. In the Anunnaki narrative, this is described as the winding down of a project. A moment when the engineers decide the system has become unstable, too noisy, too unpredictable. Instead of starting over completely, they pull back, reduce contact, set new parameters, and let the system run on its own. Some theorists extend this idea far beyond Mesopotamia. They look for traces of a sudden withdrawal in the archaeological and historical record. Not just in myth, but in material culture. They ask, does the timeline of the Anunnaki's supposed departure line up with any real turning points in human history? Look at the late 3rd millennium BC. Around 2200 BCE, something dramatic happens across a wide region. The Akkadian Empire collapses. The Old Kingdom in Egypt stumbles into a period of instability. Settlements decline in parts of the Levant. Climatic studies suggest a severe drought event. Crops fail. Trade networks fracture. Literacy in some areas retreats. To mainstream historians, these are connected episodes in the story of climate, economics, and politics. To those reading history through the Anunnaki lens, this cluster of crises looks like something else. The first generation left to fend for itself after the overseers step away. If the Anunnaki had once been present, whether as real beings or as a powerful organizing idea, their withdrawal would have consequences. You might expect confusion in religious practice. Competing temples claiming to preserve the true ritual. Sudden changes in political legitimacy, as rulers can no longer point to direct divine backing. Fragmentation of knowledge, as certain advanced techniques become guarded secrets or simply forgotten. We do see mysterious regressions in the archaeological record. There are places where construction techniques become less precise over time, not more. Periods where writing systems become simpler, where artistic detail declines, where large-scale urban planning gives way to more modest, scattered settlements. None of this proves anything about spacefaring gods. But if you believe they once walked among us, it's easy to interpret these dips and breaks as the aftershocks of their departure. Some enthusiasts point to very specific examples. The end of the Uruk period, when the world's first true cities contract. The sudden abandonment of certain early Bronze Age towns. Later, the collapse of the late Bronze Age palace economies around 1200 BCE, when old powers fall and writing nearly vanishes from some regions for centuries. In the conventional view, these are the results of trade disruptions, invasions, droughts, internal weaknesses. In the Anunnaki view, these could be flare-ups in a long, slow weaning process. Moments when a civilization built under supervision is forced to continue without it. Even flood myths begin to look different through this lens. Around the world, cultures preserve stories of a great deluge. A time when the world was washed clean, the old order destroyed, and a few survivors carried forward the memory of a lost age. In Mesopotamia, the gods regret the flood and swear never to destroy humanity again. In other traditions, mysterious teachers arrive after the waters recede, bringing agriculture, laws, and calendar knowledge. One interpretation imagines these floods and the rebuilding that follows not just as disasters, but as controlled abandonment events. A harsh final intervention followed by withdrawal. Wipe away the densest evidence of direct contact. Leave a fragmentary memory encoded in myth. Then step back. Of course, there is no way to test this scientifically. The geological record does show episodes of severe flooding, sea level rise, and local catastrophes. The myths could be memories of real events, magnified and reshaped over generations. Whether they also preserve any hint of a higher intelligence choosing to walk away is something that stays, for now, in the realm of possibility rather than proof. But even if we treat the Anunnaki entirely as story, a question lingers. If they truly left, why do so many myths, prophecies, and modern theories insist they'll come back? The Sumerian texts themselves don't give us a clear, unified promise of return. What they do show is a pattern of departure and reappearance. Gods leave cities in anger, then return when rituals are restored. Deities vanish in underworld journeys only to emerge again with the changing seasons. The divine world is never permanently gone. It's temporarily hidden. Later traditions build on this pattern. Kings receive visions that one day the gods who once guided humanity will descend again. Apocalyptic texts speak of a time when the sky will open, when ancient judges will return to weigh human actions, when the hidden knowledge of the beginning will be revealed at the end. In the Anunnaki framework, this becomes a literal expectation. The engineers who left will eventually come back to check on their work. At a psychological level, the appeal is obvious. The idea that advanced beings once shaped human destiny, then departed, explains both our sense of abandonment and our hunger for guidance. It offers a narrative for why history feels like a broken conversation. We remember a golden age vaguely as myth. We feel the weight of lost knowledge. We sense gaps in our story. Believing in the Anunnaki fills those gaps. It says, you're not alone in a random universe. Your species is part of a larger project. The chaos of history, the rises and collapses of civilizations, the sudden sparks of genius and long stretches of stagnation, these aren't just accidents. They're side effects of an experiment running without its creators. Some find that idea unsettling. Others find it oddly comforting. If someone started this, maybe someone can fix it. If someone left, maybe someone can return. For now, all we have are traces. Clay tablets that speak of gods who once walked the earth. Ruins that hint at knowledge gained and lost. Myths of floods and disappearances, of teachers who arrive from nowhere and vanish just as suddenly. Whether you see these as evidence of a real Anunnaki departure or as the symbolic story of humanity growing up, stepping out from under the shadow of imagined parents, the mystery remains the same. Something changed. The world of direct divine presence faded, and a new kind of history began. A history where humans, for better or worse, would have to find their own way. But in the background of that story, a question continues to echo through time. If they truly abandoned us, was it forever? Or is abandonment only the middle chapter of a much longer tale? The departure, if it happened, left behind more questions than answers. Why did they go? Was it completion of a mission or failure? Was it planned or forced by some catastrophe we don't understand? The texts hint at conflict among the Anunnaki themselves. Enlil and Enki disagreeing about humanity's fate. Inanna rebelling against established authority. Wars between divine factions leaving Earth as collateral damage. Maybe the departure wasn't unanimous. Maybe some wanted to stay. Maybe some did, hiding, watching, waiting for a time when they could emerge again. Or maybe the departure was simply practical. The mission complete, resources extracted, genetic experiments concluded, there was no reason to remain. Earth had become a garden that could tend itself. The workers no longer needed direct supervision. The project could run on autopilot while the Anunnaki moved on to other worlds, other experiments, other creations. Some versions of the story suggest the departure was temporary from the beginning, that the Anunnaki operate on cycles, on schedules measured in thousands of years. They arrive, they work, they leave, they return. Earth is just one stop on a much longer journey, one node in a network of worlds under their influence. In this view, the departure around the time of the flood was just the most recent in a series. They've left before. They'll leave again. But they always come back. And each time they return, they find humanity changed, evolved, either meeting their expectations or disappointing them, requiring adjustment, intervention, course correction. The archaeological record can't confirm this. But it can't completely rule it out either. Because the truth is, we don't fully understand all the rises and falls of ancient civilizations. We don't know why certain advanced cultures suddenly simplified, why knowledge seemed to be lost and then rediscovered, why progress wasn't linear but full of strange loops and reversals. Maybe it's just the messy reality of human history. Climate change, or disease, economic collapse. Cultures rise, peak, and fall for entirely natural reasons. Or maybe there's a pattern we're missing. A rhythm of intervention and withdrawal playing out over millennia, so slow and vast that we can only see fragments, only catch glimpses of something larger moving just beyond our comprehension. The departure remains one of the most poignant aspects of the Anunnaki story, because whether you believe it literally or metaphorically, it speaks to a very human experience. The feeling of abandonment. The sense that we were once guided, once protected, once part of something larger, and now we're alone. The gods have withdrawn. The parents have left. The teachers have finished their lessons and moved on. And we're left here, in the ruins of their civilization or ours, trying to piece together what they taught us, what they wanted from us, whether they'll ever come back. The departure is the wound at the heart of the story. The moment when the sky stopped speaking. When the divine became distant. When humans had to become fully human, had to take responsibility for their own fate. Maybe that was always the plan. Create a species, guide it to a certain point, then step back and see what it does on its own. The ultimate test. Not whether humans could follow instructions, but whether they could thrive without them. Whether the creation could eventually become equal to the creators. Or maybe the departure was never meant to happen. Maybe it was failure, not completion. Maybe the Anunnaki left because the experiment went wrong, because humans became too unpredictable, too dangerous, too difficult to control. Maybe they're gone because they gave up on us. We don't know. The tablets don't say. The myths are ambiguous. The archaeological record is silent on the question of why certain patterns of civilization changed when they did. All we have is the sense, passed down through thousands of years of stories, that once there was more direct contact between heaven and earth, and then there wasn't. Once the gods walked among us and then they didn't. The departure, whether real or imagined, marks the boundary between two worlds. The world of myth, where gods and humans interacted directly, and the world of history, where humans are on their own. And standing at that boundary, looking back at the myths and forward at our own future, we can't help but wonder what really happened when the sky fell silent. By the time the last Sumerian scribes were pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, the world that had birthed the Anunnaki myths was already fading. Cities rose and fell. Empires shifted. Languages changed. But one idea refused to die. The sense that the gods, the great ones who had come down from the heavens, had not simply vanished. They had gone away. And one day they might come back. When you read the surviving Sumerian and later Mesopotamian texts, you don't find a clear, simple prophecy that says, the Anunnaki will return in year X from planet Y. Ancient tablets don't work like modern science fiction scripts. They speak in cycles, in ages, in patterns of departure and reappearance. Gods withdraw to heaven in times of chaos. They return to restore order. They leave their temples empty, then suddenly descend again. When kings claim new favor from the divine, some researchers argue that buried in these cycles are hints of something more literal. They point to hymns describing the gods' radiant chariots rising to the sky, to laments where people beg the Anunnaki to come back from the distant heavens, to later Babylonian texts that speak of great ages controlled by celestial movements. The evidence is fragmentary, ambiguous, open to interpretation. But if you want to see prophecy here, the clay tablets give you just enough to wonder. Over thousands of years, this pattern of departure and possible return fused with another powerful human habit: watching the sky. The same civilizations that told stories of the Anunnaki also tracked planets and stars with astonishing precision. The motions of Jupiter, Venus, Mars were recorded, correlated with omens and royal events. Eclipses were predicted. Celestial alignments were read as messages. Much later, modern writers stitched these pieces together into a single storyline. The Anunnaki weren't just gods. They were visitors from a hidden world, a 12th planet on a long, elongated orbit. Their disappearances from history mirrored their disappearances from near-Earth space. Their promised return, some claimed, would coincide with a specific astronomical event. An unseen planet nearing the inner solar system. A great alignment along the galactic plane. A shift in Earth's precessional cycle. Astronomers have never found this 12th planet in the way these theories describe. No modern observatory has confirmed a world on a catastrophic collision course with Earth. The sky, as science measures it, is quiet, methodical, consistent. But the story persists. It mutates. It adapts. When one date for the Anunnaki's return comes and goes uneventfully, another configuration, another alignment, another interpretation takes its place. And in the background, something else is happening. Since the mid-20th century, a new kind of skywatching has taken hold. Strange lights. Unidentified craft. Objects tracked on radar, filmed by military jets, reported by pilots and civilians. The UFO phenomenon, once dismissed as pure fantasy, has edged its way into mainstream discussion. Government files have been declassified. Official panels now talk openly about unidentified anomalous phenomena. For some people, these modern mysteries slot neatly into the ancient story. The Anunnaki, they say, never truly left. Or if they did, they've been checking in regularly. Abduction stories become updated contact myths. Crop circles echo sacred symbols. Metallic discs and triangles replace the heavenly boats and flying thrones of clay tablet descriptions. When a new UFO video goes viral, someone somewhere connects it back to Sumer. Is there actual evidence that the Anunnaki and modern UFOs are the same thing? Not in a way that would satisfy a historian or a physicist. The timelines are fuzzy. The interpretations of the texts are heavily debated. The UFO data is fragmentary, often low resolution, frequently contradictory. But belief doesn't require certainty. It just needs a pattern compelling enough to hold the imagination in its grip. And that's where the Anunnaki's supposed return becomes less a question of ancient astronomy and more a mirror held up to modern hopes and fears. In spiritual and UFO communities, the idea of returning sky beings has become almost a framework for understanding reality. For some, the Anunnaki are framed as benevolent elder siblings, ready to step back in when humanity reaches a certain level of awareness or crisis. For others, they're exploiters, here once more to manage their genetic project, to harvest resources, to reset civilization. Meditation groups claim to channel messages from them. Online forums debate which star systems they're associated with. Conspiracy theorists map global politics onto secret Anunnaki factions, arguing that returns have already begun, in hidden underground bases, in shadowy government programs, in space missions that never appear in the news. None of this can be verified. But all of it reveals something important. People are using the Anunnaki to tell a story about us. The astronomical claims follow the same pattern. One generation focuses on a particular comet, another on a predicted planetary alignment, another on the end of a Mayan calendar cycle folded into Sumerian timelines and precessional ages. Each time the script is rewritten. This is when the gate will open, when Nibiru will reappear, when the Anunnaki will step out of the shadows. Each time the physical world carries on more or less as before. Skeptics point out, correctly, that ancient prophecy is notoriously easy to retrofit to events after the fact. Vague lines about great kings falling or dark stars rising can be repurposed endlessly. What looks like precise prediction often appears precise only in hindsight. Mythology and genuine prophecy blur into one another, especially when texts have been copied, re-edited, and reinterpreted across centuries and languages. With the Anunnaki, that problem is magnified. We're dealing with damaged tablets, lost libraries, and modern translations layered with assumptions. Some keywords have no exact equivalent in English. Are they vehicles or clouds or divine thrones? Are they planets or stars or symbolic powers? Every choice a translator makes nudges the story in one direction or another. So when someone points to a line and declares, "This proves the Anunnaki will return in our lifetime," what we're really seeing is a modern mind reaching back through time and pulling meaning out of ambiguity. And yet, the persistence of this belief is its own kind of data. Even when the predicted dates pass. Even when telescopes fail to find the fatal planet. Even when official UFO reports remain inconclusive. The story continues. It evolves. In novels, in movies, in long late-night videos that blend clay tablets with satellite images and speculative astronomy, the Anunnaki become stand-ins for something larger. A sense that we are not alone. That history has hidden chapters. That someone out there knows more about us than we know about ourselves. Maybe that's what these prophecies, real or imagined, are ultimately about. On one level, they're about return. The hope that powerful beings will come back and explain everything, fix everything, reveal the missing pieces of our story. On another level, they're about responsibility. The fear that those same beings will judge what we've done with the world they supposedly helped create. At a deeper level, they reveal a very human pattern. When faced with uncertainty about our origins, our future, our place in the universe, we reach for narratives that connect past and future in a single arc. The Anunnaki become the authors of that arc. Their departure is our fall into confusion. Their return is our resolution. Whether there is any literal return on the horizon is an open question. The tablets don't give us a date. The stars don't spell out a clear appointment. The UFO data sits in a gray zone between known and unknown. We're left in the same place the ancient storytellers were, looking up at the sky, imagining who might be looking back. But the endurance of the Anunnaki's promised return tells us something unambiguous about ourselves. It tells us that we expect continuity between the oldest myths and the newest mysteries. That we hope meaning runs like a hidden thread from Sumerian clay tablets to modern radar screens. That some part of us still waits quietly for someone or something to step out of the dark and say, "We've been here before. We're back." Until that happens, if it ever does, the Anunnaki remain where they have always been. Half in the text, half in the sky, and half in the human imagination, promising just enough to keep us watching the heavens a little longer. The prophecy of return is powerful because it transforms abandonment into anticipation. The gods didn't leave forever. They're coming back. We're not orphaned. We're waiting. And in that waiting there's purpose. There's meaning. There's the possibility that everything will be explained, all the mysteries solved, all the questions answered. When the sky opens and the Anunnaki descend, we'll finally know. We'll know if we were created or evolved. If we're alone or part of a cosmic family. If history has been random or guided. If our suffering had meaning or was just the grinding of indifferent natural forces. The return becomes not just the end of the story but the revelation. The moment when everything clicks into place. When the fragments of myth and the gaps in history suddenly make sense because the beings who started it all have come back to finish what they began. Whether that day will ever come, we can't say. The evidence isn't there. The prophecies are ambiguous. The sky remains silent in all the ways that matter. But the human heart doesn't work on evidence alone. It works on hope, on possibility, on the refusal to accept that the greatest questions might never have answers. And so the belief persists. The Anunnaki will return. Maybe in our lifetime. Maybe in our children's. Maybe in some distant age when humanity has finally proven itself worthy or finally descended into such chaos that intervention becomes necessary. The when doesn't matter as much as the certainty that somewhere, somehow they're still watching, still caring, still connected to the species they allegedly created so long ago. The return is the promise that sustains the entire story. Without it, the Anunnaki are just another abandoned mythology, another set of gods who faded when their civilizations fell. But with it, they remain living possibilities. Beings who might, at any moment, step back into our reality and change everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our place in the universe. All through this journey, we've been walking a thin line between clay tablets and cosmic speculation. 10 stories circling the same unsettling idea. That long before written history, someone or something might have intervened in human development. That our origins might be stranger than we're comfortable admitting. That the ancient world might have witnessed things we've dismissed too quickly in our rush to explain everything through natural processes. We heard about humans shaped through genetic manipulation instead of slow evolution. The claim that beings called the Anunnaki took primitive hominids and upgraded them, mixed divine essence with earthly clay, created a worker species designed for specific purposes. The texts describe it. The genetic anomalies in human DNA, the fused chromosome, the rapid cognitive revolution, they raise questions. But mainstream science has natural explanations, and no confirmed evidence of artificial intervention exists. We explored the theory of a hidden 12th planet, Nibiru, carrying the Anunnaki across the dark on a 3,600-year orbit. The astronomical knowledge of ancient Sumer is real and impressive. The claims about a catastrophic planet swinging through the inner solar system are not supported by modern observations. No telescope has found it. No gravitational anomalies confirm it. The cylinder seals have alternate interpretations. But the Sumerian obsession with the heavens, the precision of their observations, that genuine mystery remains. We examined ancient mining operations in southern Africa, some dated to 100,000 years ago or more, focused on gold extraction. The Anunnaki theory says these were their operations, that gold was needed to save a dying atmosphere on their homeworld, that humans were created specifically to work these mines. The mines are real. The dating is controversial. The interpretation that links them to extraterrestrial resource extraction lacks the infrastructure evidence you'd expect. Advanced mining requires advanced processing, transportation, administration. None of that has been found. We looked at the Sumerian pantheon, the detailed hierarchy of gods with specific roles, territories, technologies. Anu, the distant supreme authority. Enlil, the commander on earth. Enki, the scientist and creator. Inanna, Ninhursag, Ninurta, dozens of deities described with the kind of practical detail that makes them feel less like abstract concepts and more like actual individuals. The ancient astronaut interpretation sees alien administrators. Conventional scholarship sees personified natural forces and cultural projections. Both views have evidence. Neither can definitively prove the other wrong. We considered the descriptions of ancient wars fought with weapons that sound disturbingly advanced. Weapons of brilliance that destroyed cities, turned day into night, made the earth shake. The era epic, the Mahabharata, biblical accounts of Sodom and Gomorrah, they all describe catastrophic destruction in terms that echo nuclear warfare. The archaeological evidence shows destroyed cities, vitrification, unexplained abandonment. Natural explanations exist: earthquakes, volcanoes, meteors. But the pattern of destruction, the clustering in time and space, it invites questions. We explored underground structures like Durinkwiyu, vast subterranean cities carved with precision and purpose. The theory of Anunnaki underground bases proposes that advanced beings would prefer to work beneath the surface, shielded from radiation and observation. The engineering is real. The age and original purpose of the deepest levels remain debated. The leap from impressive ancient excavation to extraterrestrial base is large, unsupported by physical evidence of alien presence. We examined claims of forbidden knowledge encoded in cuneiform tablets. The idea that advanced astronomical, medical and technical information was preserved in Sumerian texts but domesticated in translation to sound safely mythological. The tablets are real. The translations are debated. Some astronomical knowledge is surprisingly sophisticated. Whether it came from careful observation over centuries or from an external source teaching humans what they shouldn't know, that remains an open question. We looked at the possibility of genetic legacy, Anunnaki DNA passed down through bloodlines, particularly through royal families who claim divine descent. Modern genetics shows no confirmed alien sequences in human DNA. We trace back to African origins through entirely natural evolutionary processes. The anomalies that exist, chromosome fusion, rapid brain development, have conventional explanations. But the mystery of why human evolution accelerated so dramatically in such a short period, that persists. We considered why the Anunnaki supposedly left Earth, whether it was completion of a mission, failure of an experiment, or simply the natural end of a cycle of intervention. The archaeological record shows cultural collapses, knowledge regressions, periods where civilization seemed to simplify rather than advance. Whether this reflects the removal of external guidance or simply the normal chaos of human history, we can't definitively say. And we examined the persistent prophecy that the Anunnaki will return. The astronomical calculations, the UFO connections, the channeled messages, the conspiracy theories. The belief that departure wasn't permanent. That somewhere in the sky or beneath the earth, they're watching, waiting, preparing to re-emerge when the time is right. The evidence for this is entirely speculative. The persistence of the belief is very real. When we step out of the shadows and into the light of evidence, the picture becomes clearer. The Sumerian texts are real. The cities, the temples, the kings, those are documented. The gods' names, the rituals, the myths, we can read them. What we don't have is a clear, unbroken chain from those texts to spacecraft, gene labs, or star maps we can verify. There's a gap, a wide one, between what the tablets literally say, what later interpreters think they might imply, and what modern theories build on top of that. Archaeologists see poetic myth and royal propaganda. Some researchers see encoded memory of real encounters. Right now, the data doesn't let us prove either side with certainty. And yet, these stories refuse to die. They persist because they answer questions that haunt us. Why are we here? Why this sudden leap to cities, writing, astronomy, civilization? Are we alone in the universe? Or are we part of someone else's project? When the official answers feel incomplete, Anunnaki narratives slip into the empty spaces, connecting dots our minds can't stop trying to connect. In that sense, these tales tell us as much about ourselves as they do about any possible ancient visitors. They reveal our discomfort with randomness, our preference for intention over accident, design over chaos. They show our hunger for meaning and our willingness to gaze into the dark and imagine companions looking back. Curiosity is not the enemy of science. It's the engine. As long as we're honest about what we know, what we don't, and where we're speculating, exploring these stories can sharpen our questions instead of dulling them. The Anunnaki narrative forces us to look at the gaps in our knowledge. The moments where the archaeological record goes silent. The civilizations that rose too fast. The knowledge that appeared too complete. The technologies that seemed too advanced. Maybe those gaps are just the natural result of incomplete evidence. Time erases things. Wars destroy records. Climate buries cities. We're looking at the distant past through a fog of millennia, so of course we can't see everything clearly. Or maybe the gaps are telling us something. Maybe there are pieces missing from the official story. Not necessarily alien visitors, but something. Lost civilizations. Forgotten technologies. Contact between cultures we thought were isolated. Knowledge that was preserved and then lost. The value of the Anunnaki story, regardless of its literal truth, is that it keeps us asking questions. It keeps us looking at ancient mysteries with fresh eyes. It prevents us from becoming too comfortable with explanations that don't quite explain everything. It reminds us that the past might be stranger than we think, that our ancestors might have been more capable than we assume, that history might have more chapters than we've discovered. But it also teaches us about the danger of pattern recognition run wild. About how easy it is to see what we want to see. To connect dots that shouldn't be connected. To mistake metaphor for fact, poetry for history, myth for memory. The human brain is a pattern-seeking machine. We see faces in clouds, meaning in randomness, design in chaos. It's how we survived. But it's also how we fool ourselves. The Anunnaki could be real. Ancient visitors who shaped early human civilization and then departed, leaving behind only fragmentary memories encoded in myth. Or they could be entirely mythological. Personifications of natural forces, cultural heroes elevated to divine status, stories created to explain the unexplainable and give meaning to human suffering. Or they could be something in between. Real human leaders, perhaps from a more advanced civilization now lost to history, who were remembered and mythologized over time until they became gods. Real historical events, floods and wars and migrations, that were preserved in story form and gradually accumulated supernatural elements. Real astronomical observations mixed with religious belief, creating narratives that blend fact and fantasy so thoroughly that we can no longer separate them. The truth is we don't know, and that's okay. Not knowing is the beginning of discovery. The unanswered question is what drives us to keep looking, keep digging, keep translating ancient texts and excavating ancient cities. The mystery is what makes us human. The capacity to wonder, to question, to imagine possibilities beyond what we can currently prove. So before you drift off, I'd like to hear from you. Which Anunnaki story felt the most plausible? Which one felt like pure myth? Do you think there was ancient contact, or are we projecting our modern hopes and fears onto broken tablets? Let me know in the comments what you think and where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a quiet apartment in the city, somewhere out in the countryside halfway around the world? Different time zones, different places, but all here together thinking about the same ancient mysteries. If you enjoyed this journey through Sumerian shadows and cosmic speculation, tap like so more night owls can find it. Subscribe for more history told in the dark, more mysteries that sit in that space between what we can prove and what we wonder. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive into the unexplained. For now, we leave the Anunnaki where they've always been. Half in the clay, half in the stars, waiting in that space between what we can prove and what still might be possible. The tablets will keep their secrets a while longer. The stars will continue their ancient patterns. The questions will remain unanswered. And somewhere in that uncertainty, in that beautiful, frustrating mystery, we'll keep wondering, keep asking, keep looking up at the night sky and imagining who might be looking back. The Sumerians are long gone. Their cities are ruins. Their language is dead. But their stories survive. The Anunnaki, whether they ever walked this earth or only walked through human imagination, remain with us. In every question about our origins. In every gap in the historical record. In every moment when we look at an ancient achievement and wonder how they did it. They remain in our DNA, whether literally or metaphorically. In the part of us that refuses to accept simple answers. In the curiosity that drives us to dig deeper, translate older texts, explore further into the past. In the hope that somewhere in all those fragments of clay and stone and myth, there's a truth waiting to be discovered. Maybe the Anunnaki were real. Maybe they weren't. Maybe the truth is stranger than either possibility. Maybe it's simpler. But the fact that we're still asking the question, still exploring the mystery, still open to the possibility that our past might be more extraordinary than we imagine, that's what matters. That's what keeps us human. That's what keeps us searching. And that's what makes these ancient stories, true or false, meaningful. They remind us that we don't have all the answers, that the universe might be bigger and stranger than we think, that somewhere between the stars and the clay, between science and myth, between what we know and what we wonder, there's a space where anything is possible. Sleep well. Dream of ancient cities and distant stars, of beings who came from the heavens and walked among humans, of secrets carved in clay and buried beneath the sand. And when you wake, the questions will still be there, waiting. The Anunnaki, whether they ever existed or not, will still be calling from the past, calling us to wonder, to question, to never stop seeking the truth wherever it might lead. Good night.